The year is 1812, and the USA is invading Canada. They're doing this while Britain, Canada's colonial overlord, is busy fighting a long and brutal war with Napoleon in Europe. So they can't help as much as they would want to. Now obviously, Canada has never ended up being part of the USA, as much as that must annoy a certain incoming US president who would very much like it to be. So how did Canada survive? And more importantly, why did the USA do this in the first place? Let's find out. Let's go back to the War of Independence. It's 1783 and everyone is celebrating that the USA has been created. Washington is elected as the first president, and everyone's pretty happy. Alexander Hamilton is pretty influential. After 2 terms of Washington, we get John Adams. But he's not so happy. No one stood against Washington. He ran uncontested both times. No one had a chance of beating him, really. But now that he was out of the way, Jefferson had campaigned hard against him. Political divisions were starting to emerge in the United States, the beginnings of a 2-party system. Jefferson and John Adams hate each other. Jefferson beats him at the next election. Now, all of this presidential back and forth has some relevance to the war, because John Adams and Jefferson have very different ideas about the future of the USA. Adams isn't interested in expanding the country. He thinks they have quite a lot of land. They do. But some would argue he's pushing for this kind of restriction in expansion because he knows that people like him who own property will see a huge increase in the value of their property if it's limited. Jefferson comes from the opposite point of view. He wants to massively expand the country. His logic, if you're being kind, is that you want political power to derive from land ownership. You want as much cheap land as possible so that as many people can take part as possible. That's if you're being kind. It could just be that he hates natives and he wanted to kill them off. Who can say? In particular, he wants to expand into the native-held lands around Lake Michigan and the Northwest in general. But this has so far had nothing to do with Britain, right? This is where it starts. Because Jefferson becomes president and the USA starts expanding towards the Northwest, Britain still has what will become Canada. And this means that there starts to be some conflicts at the borders. Not so much directly with each other, but the natives still hold a lot of that land. Britain decides to put a fly in the ointment, something to annoy the USA. First, after the War of Independence, they were meant to have given back these places, but they never do. Instead, they just keep them. They're important for them because out of Montreal, they're running a fur trade, and a lot of these places are good sources of fur. So they hold on to them for as long as possible. But in the 1890s, a treaty is signed, everything calms down, and war doesn't look very likely. But that's not the only thing that the Americans start to become pissed off at regarding this expansion. So they gain back these locations that they'd previously lost, and everything's fine, right? And they're moving into new areas. But in those new areas, they're running into a lot of confederations. The natives are starting to unite against the upcoming threat of the USA. Britain decides to help the natives by giving them some weapons here, some supplies there. They're slowly building up the strength of the natives against the USA. Because ultimately, if the USA is going to fail, they're going to need these confederations to really dig into them and make it hard for them to be a viable country. And ultimately, the Confederacies know that if it comes to war, Britain should be on their side. Jefferson and later Madison are not happy about this at all. It's a huge blocker in their future plans. Add to this, in the late 1790s and early 1800s, Britain is involved in a proto-World War with France, especially Napoleon, what we now call the Revolutionary Wars or the Napoleonic Wars. This has effects on the USA too. First, Britain blockades all of mainland Europe, basically, making it very hard for the USA to trade with them. Second, because of this big war, the British Navy needs more sailors. One way they do this is to force people into the Navy. It's called impressment, and they start doing this in the USA. Now, how big a deal that impressment was, we'll never really know. There's not much evidence to suggest it was a huge problem, but politically it was made into a huge issue by Madison, Jefferson, and their allies. So the USA is annoyed about 3 different things. There's support for the natives, there's impressment of their sailors, and there's the prevention of free trade with the rest of Europe. All of these and the political whirlwind that comes with them lead the USA to declare war on the UK in 1812. It's a bold strategy, and the explicit goal of the war is to take Canada from the British. So how does it go? Britain could really do without this distraction because, as we've discussed, it's a really tough time fighting Napoleon and the USA at the same time. 2012 is also a huge year for the war with Napoleon. So it should be really easy for the USA to get a good head start while Britain's distracted in Europe. Conquering Canada's the aim, so marching up north to fight there makes perfect sense, and it's what they do. The first major event is on Mackinac Island in July 1812. A tiny group of British soldiers, with huge help from natives, take the fort there without a single shot being fired. Hugely embarrassing for the Americans. This is William Hull, an American general. He takes the Northwestern Army and marches it up towards Canada. They're the ones whose main responsibility will be to conquer Canada and achieve the war goal. But at Detroit, William and his army lose badly. They are captured. We'll hear about him towards the end of this story, because as you would imagine, it didn't go quite so well for him after this. So a pretty shocking start, but it wasn't all about defeats for the USA. They managed to capture and kill Tecumseh, the Confederacy leader, in Moraviantown. Another important leader at this time is Isaac Brooks. He's leading the British in the war, and the Americans kill him too. This is a huge blow for the British, one that it takes them years to recover from. But despite these wins, they're struggling to take any real territory from Canada, which after all is the main war goal. But then in the greater context of the war, two really odd things happen. Two of the main reasons for fighting disappear. First, the end of the war with Napoleon means the end of the blockade, meaning the USA can now trade with the rest of Europe. And as an added benefit, Britain doesn't need so many sailors, so impressment ends. Which is a slightly weird situation to be in. Two of the three major reasons you're in the war no longer apply. So both sides are in a war that has no real point just a few months into it. And despite not being able to take Canada, the USA keeps trying. And while there, they commit the odd atrocity, e.g. burning a village to the ground in the middle of winter, leaving 400 people without shelter. Generally burning crops that mean that people wouldn't be able to survive the winter. This kind of thing. I mean, it makes military sense to do this, it just is incredibly brutal to the civilians. It's just worth noting that. And it wasn't just the USA carrying out these atrocities. The natives also carried some out in the early stages of the war, which really got the Americans going and got them motivated to fight. However, all this burning and destruction in Canada is really starting to piss the British off. This is Cochrane, and he has a bright idea. Forget all this nonsense tit for tat in Canada and draw the attention away from there. He has a brilliant plan. Blockade the Chesapeake, and then raid Washington, D.C. There's a militia stationed in the capital. The 1,200 British men defeat them easily. They start rampaging through the city, burning everything they can, including the newly built White House. When they're done with it, only the shell is left. They have to knock it down and start all over again. So the Americans are suddenly in a lot of trouble. But what's Britain going to do with the city now that it holds it? We'll come back to that. But even at this stage, it's not all gloom for the USA in the war. They've managed to kill some leaders, as we've seen earlier. But they also win some pretty major battles. Big victories in Baltimore, Plattsburgh, which was mainly a naval battle, Chippewa, and New Orleans. All of those happened during the war. But for every major victory, there was an almost equivalent major failure, with bad defeats in Mackinac and Bladensburg. And in general, the invasion of Canada was not going well. They really struggled to supply the army, which gets us to one of the big differences between this war and the War of Independence. In the War of Independence, the quality of your leaders and your ability to get good supplies were crucial, and it's something the USA did very well there. But another big difference is, in the War of Independence, France and Spain fought alongside the USA. This time, the USA was on its own. So these two factors help explain why the USA wasn't able to win this war quite easily now that it was fully independent. Meanwhile, money is running out. The people hate this war. Madison and the USA are in big trouble. And let's not forget that Britain has raided Washington, D.C. It's tempting to think what would happen if Britain had kept it, right? I mean, why don't they? One, they just don't have the numbers. They have just 1,200 men. That's nowhere near enough to hold such an important location. The chances of getting attacked in response are too high. Also, it's not just the Americans that hate this war. The British detest it. They've been at war with France almost continuously between the French Revolution and Napoleon. And all they want is some peace. And then this war comes along just to extend the time they've been at war. Naturally, no one wants to send more men to fight. And as a result, no more extra men to hold on to places like Washington, D.C. Battles keep going, like at New Orleans with this man, Andrew Jackson, a complete unknown I've never heard of before or since. But the funny thing is, no one fighting it realised that the war was already officially over. Not actually that uncommon a thing in these days, but still a bit sad. People would have died for no reason. The outcome of the war, as we know, most of the major issues had already been resolved by this point of the war. In fact, in the first year. But Britain was so desperate to get out of this war, it agreed not to help the natives so much in future, which left the USA a free hand to do whatever it wants with native-held land. And I hear that worked out really well for the natives in the long run. When it's all said and done, William Hull from earlier, who had lost so easily at the beginning of the war, was sentenced to treason for losing that battle. And some in America start to believe that they won the war, purely because of the Battle of New Orleans. I mean, winning a battle at the end of the war does kind of give you the impression that you've won, right? But they hadn't. And if you're being kind, you would kind of call this a draw because no one really gets much out of it. If you're not being kind to the USA, you'd probably have to say that they lost because the aim was to take Canada and that just didn't happen. But it doesn't cause any kind of long-term effects in the USA. If anything, the opposition to Madison and Jefferson is wiped out by the war because the Federalists, who are their main opposition, are against it. And because it kind of turns out okay, especially with some of the battles that are won, this leads to what is called the era of good feelings, when there was basically no political opposition in the USA. You'd say the only real long-term effects of the war are that both sides realise it probably isn't worth fighting each other over petty issues, which they never do again, and there's also an uptick in American nationalism as a result, which is always great. But that unknown guy I mentioned, Andrew Jackson, wasn't really that unknown. I'm sure some of you know that he eventually became US president, which was helped a little bit at least by the fact that he'd won some important battles during the War of 1812. And he was one hell of a divisive president. And not for any minor thing really, he was awful towards natives. Some called him a dictator, and a whole political party was created to try and get rid of him. That's how hated he was. And he's just one of 5 presidents that people have generally looked at as a bit dictatorial. And funnily enough, I made a whole video where I analysed that, including our friend Andrew. You've also got FDR, Abe Lincoln, Washington, and if that doesn't tickle your fancy, maybe join the Patreon, where you can get exclusive content on some of the videos that get released. For example, in the last 2 videos, you get a whole extra minute and uncensored content as a result of watching on Patreon. Anyway, no obligation. You can join, not join. You can join, then quit, whatever you want to do. Anyway, have a good time. Bye.